Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this morning, and first to do a commercial that the library has asked me to make for Thursday's Primetime session, which will be with Tyler Furta, who is the first Student Research Award winner through the library's competitive process. So Thursday during this time, Taylor Furta will be presenting his research on Alcuin and Vikings, a theology of Carolinian election, chastisement, and exaltation. So that's Thursday at this time with Taylor Furta. This morning we have the pleasure to hear from Sara Shady and Taylor on research that they've been doing now as part of their Edgren Scholars Award. And I had the really great pleasure of hearing them, as well as Marion and Annie, at the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities in Atlanta this past February, where they presented their research. And those of you that are faculty or administrators, you know you go to conferences, and often there are sessions where people get up and walk out midway through rudely, maybe never in your sessions.
No, never happened.
But
Just fall asleep.
The conferences that I go to, often people get sort of huffy and they leave thinking, oh, this is completely irrelevant, I'm going to go do emails. And in this conference, the same thing happened. I was in sessions where folks got up and left, or they didn't ask questions, and they didn't ask questions afterwards. And when Marion and Sara and Ann and Annie presented, not only did no one leave, but people stayed, and they stayed, and they stayed to ask questions. And they were presenting on the topic that they're going to present on today, which is building bridges to different perspectives, understanding and evaluating the role of religion in public discourse. So I know you're in for a treat because I've heard a version of this, and ask you to welcome them this morning.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of meeting Annie for the first time in my social and political philosophy class last fall. And in that class, one of the guiding themes or topics of the class was about having healthy political discourse. How do we foster healthy political discourse? What does that look like? What would a healthy civil society look like? And particularly, how do you build a healthy civic discourse in civil society in the midst of religious diversity? And as part of that, I had students participate in interfaith dialogues outside of class. Annie as well as Anna participated in those. And out of that fueled two separate Edgren projects. Now, Annie and I are going to actually start off today with a video clip that we refer to as the clip that started it all. And we're going to show you a short clip from Cornel West, the book that he wrote, Democracy Matters, Winning the Fight Against Imperialism. The speech he's giving is about that book. That book was released in 2004. And he's talking about his concern over the health of American democracy moving into the 21st century in a post-9/11 world where we have religious tensions now playing into political realities. And so we're going to show you this clip, and then Annie's going to explain how this clip inspired her to start thinking about the questions we ended up researching in our project. I want to say a quick disclaimer about the video clip. Those of you who are familiar with Cornel West will know this. He starts most of his speeches by saying that he hopes he says something that thoroughly unsettles you. And he uses language to be provocative, to be powerful, and there you will see that in a couple of the word choices that he uses. But it makes a point about hate and tension that's important for what Annie wants to talk about. So we're going to go ahead and quickly show you this video clip.
"9/11 has changed things. I think President Bush is right about that. It hasn't changed everything, but it's changed things. I'm thoroughly convinced that we were living at a moment of deep crisis and emergency before 9/11. When I looked at the condition of young people, condition of working people, you see. But after 9/11, never before in the history of this country have all Americans felt unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. It's a new condition. Many of my white brothers and sisters walk up to me and say, "You know, Brother West, I just can't get over this sense of being hated. It's a new experience. I say, you don't say. Really? Because of course, to be a nigger in America for 350 years up until the 1960s was to be unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. Now the whole nation's niggerized. This is a feeling of a certain kind of helplessness. A certain sense that you're not in control. A certain sense that you can't push a button for overnight solution. A sense that maybe your optimism was too Disney World-like. I know I'm in LA and I didn't say that intentionally, but it's not Peter Pan. You're not forever young, locked into some narrow sophomoric discourse of innocence, some melodramatic story that says all the good's on one side and all the evil's on the other, and the villains are impure and the heroes are pure. Maybe, in fact, the Socratic questioning and the prophetic witness needs to take seriously the black creation of the blues. The tragic comic hope that says we have been through terrorism. Emmett Till's mother, what do you say to your child, your only child, who went down to Mississippi in August of 1955 and found his body in the Tallahatchie River? You have to say something to the world in responding to terrorism. And you recall that historic moment in Chicago in 1955 when she allowed her baby, her only baby, as I noted, to lie before the pulpit and to keep the coffin open. 50,000 fellow citizens marched through to see this victim of American terrorism. His head was 5 times the size of his ordinary head. And what did she say when she stepped to the lectern? I don't have a minute to hate. I'll pursue justice for the rest of my life. There's a level of moral maturity and spiritual strength that come through a blues sensibility, a tragic comic hope in which you can still somehow muster a smile in the midst of such darkness and not stoop to the gutter of revenge and resentment and bitterness that completely eats up your soul. Brother Martin did the same thing when he had to speak to 4 young sisters in Birmingham when American terrorists killed those innocent fellow citizens. You all are too young to remember one of the few times Brother Martin had tears in his eyes in public because he didn't know what to say. He looked into the eyes of the parents as they were crying, just as all of us shed tears responding to our fellow citizens and fellow human beings, 9/11, whatever, no matter what color they were. Martin, what do you have to say? He says, somehow we must muster. We must come up with a language that deploys the armor of love and justice. What a standard set, you see. And when we look at the dominant responses to American terrorism, the dominant responses to niggerization since 9/11. Revenge, hunt them down like cockroaches, machismo identities, Lone Ranger sensibilities. It falls far short of the standards set by Emmett Till's mother and the standards set by Martin Luther King Jr. This text in part raises the question, can a blues nation learn from a blues people? Not because black folk have any monopoly.
Okay, so is this Sara? You can hear it, just talk to it. All right, so watching this clip obviously doesn't explicitly relate to religious diversity, but it poses this question, what can a blues nation learn from a blues people? And watching this, it felt very novel, yet simultaneously very obvious. And why hadn't this question been asked before? And can it be asked in different ways? Are there other experiences of minorities in America or overlooked people groups that could help the whole but are untapped? So we were asking the question, how does religious diversity fit into this? And as we looked further into it, instead of finding strengths offered by various religious perspectives, we found essentially silence. There was no dialogue. The dialogue was stale, if not absent altogether. We found that religiously pluralist dialogue either centered around theological debates over ultimate truths or around universalist conceptions that all roads lead to the same mountaintop. And we really wanted to change that dialogue and the focus of that dialogue. And we weren't looking for a theological dialogue about truth. We were looking for a dialogue about finding strengths in diversity and how that would help the whole on a political and civic level. And formerly, the debate in the civic and political sphere has only centered around Christianity and secularism and trying to navigate between those two. And we're arguing essentially that we need to broaden that and include other religions.
And Annie and I, and we'll talk about more about our surprise at not finding more actual things going on, because when we started thinking about this project, what would it mean to have really healthy civic blue sensibility discourse about religious diversity, there are big picture thinkers talking about this. Eboo Patel, the founder and director of the Interfaith Youth Corps, in his famous book Acts of Faith, writes, 100 years ago, the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois warned that the problem of the 20th century would be what he called the problem of the color line. The 21st century might well be dominated by a different line, no less divisive, no less violent, the faith line. The faith line does not divide people of divergent faith traditions or religious people from secular people. Instead, this line divides religious totalitarians from religious pluralists. We'll talk more about this idea of religious pluralism in the sense that Patel means it and in the sense that we mean it as we move forward today, because we want to be clear that we're not advocating a theological pluralism, we're talking about civic pluralism. So Patel, along with West, is making a connection between thinking about how we deal with racial diversity and racial reconciliation, applying that to religion. Diana Eck, the director of Harvard's Pluralism Project, a theologian, also in the early 21st century writing about it, and she says, my work in the World Council of Churches has enabled me to meet a wide range of Christians. Among those with whom I have worked are some of the most vigorous proponents of interreligious dialogue. Church people from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East for whom dialogue is an urgent life and death matter. As a rabbi friend in Britain once put it, it's dialogue or die. Even in Obama's inaugural address, this came up. And Obama said a little over a year ago, talking about, in his inaugural address, if you remember, he's talking about all the problems facing America in the 21st century. And then he talks about how we're going to address those problems. And he says, we know that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus and non-believers. We are shaped by every language and culture drawn from every end of this earth, and because we have tasted the bitter swill of civil war and segregation and emerged from that dark chapter stronger and more united, we cannot help but believe that the old hatreds shall someday pass, that the lines of tribes shall soon dissolve, that as the world grows smaller, our common humanity shall reveal itself, and that America must play its role in ushering in a new era of peace. And I think it's interesting and telling that Obama, the first example of diversity he gives is religious, right? And so we've got speeches, books, things being published talking about the need to address racial diversity and racial reconciliation as we continue our efforts on racial reconciliation to building the religious reconciliation. And so Annie and I started talking about doing a research project together. And it's hard to make a humanities project work like a science or social science project, but we'll talk about our hypothesis. Our hypothesis, the idea that we had, was that interfaith dialogue could provide a really useful tool for fostering constructive and inclusive political dialogue. We know that interfaith dialogue is happening. We've got these voices talking about the importance of interfaith partnerships. So we plan to research models of where this was happening and how this was happening to get some insight on some constructive models for political discourse. As part of that research, Annie went to Washington. I went to South Africa for the beginning of our summer research projects. Do you want to say a little bit about what you did in Washington?
I was an intern in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, so I worked with my boss and was working on writing a bill for foreign assistance. And so it actually ended up not having really explicit correlations to what Sara and myself were doing. It felt like I was working in this very tangible world of public policy and legislation, and wasn't finding out a lot about this abstract concept of dialogue with religious pluralism. But what came from that is that we really want to argue the importance that it not be so abstract, and that it be more accessible and more able to be practiced, I guess.
Right, so all the ideas that we were reading about and hearing about and thinking about, realized, not a lot is actually happening in the real world, in the practical world, on the ground. I went to South Africa as part of a CCCU research team of 9 North American scholars and 9 African scholars to study the role of religion in South Africa's democracy, and the role of religion in politics is one of my areas of research. So that was, very interesting, and I was hoping to find about interfaith partnerships in South Africa. And what I found is right now there really aren't any strong ones functioning at the level they functioned during the struggle against apartheid. If you go back during the struggle against apartheid, interfaith partnerships are really strong. The Muslim neighborhoods in Cape Town, you've got the religious leaders going to the top of the mosque and with the call to prayer also singing out directions for where to go to the next underground meeting to talk about the struggle against apartheid. And nobody knew what they were saying, right? Because they're not saying it in English or in Afrikaans, of course. And so, but what in my research of South Africa after the end of apartheid, those interfaith partnerships have fallen aside. There's no good reason for that. It's not like there was some fundamental disagreement, but it was the loss of uniting problem to organize against. And it's certainly not that South Africa doesn't still have problems to rally around when you think about issues of AIDS and poverty and immigration and refugees and all of those sorts of issues that I researched. But one of my trip leaders was the president of the South African Council of Churches, and I really grilled him on this. Where are your interfaith partnerships? Well, I don't know. The South African Council of Churches doesn't have them right now. And we had some really good conversations about why and what that might look like to get them going. But the problem was Annie and I found not a lot was happening. So, as a philosopher, and as Annie is a philosophy major, we thought, well, let's go back to the theory. Let's go back and read some of the major works on religion in public life and try to see what's going on. Do these suggest models that we can help translate into thinking about interreligious discourse? What we found was that if you look at 20th century political philosophy and moving into the 21st century, although this debate has kind of gotten stale, we find a stalled debate between Christianity and secularism. The debate, so a great deal of literature has been devoted to the role of religion in the public sphere, and there are battle lines drawn, and philosophers like Robert Audi and John Rawls and Richard Rorty take a prominent stance on one side, arguing that the public sphere should be a secular space, and although they differ on their views regarding whether or not religion should be absolutely excluded from public life, this camp of philosophers clearly advocates that a secular sphere is the healthiest model for contemporary liberal democracies. In their view, allowing religion in the public sphere is more divisive than constructive. To use the words of Richard Rorty, religion can create a conversation stopper when attempting to communicate with the non-religious. How do you have public discourse when people are, issuing conversation stoppers? I can't talk to you about your political views because they're rooted in a tradition I don't believe in. On the other side, key thinkers like Philip Quinn and Nicholas Wolterstorff have argued, and others have argued, for the legitimacy of religious reasons in the public sphere, believing that Christians should be able to voice political views rooted in their religious views. In fact, they would argue that we're being somewhat disingenuous if we don't do this, that it's actually impossible to not have your religious views informing your political views, and it's unfair for the proponent of secularism to disallow this. But as Annie and I were reading lots of works in this debate, we realized some limitations that limit the possibility of promoting the sort of inclusive dialogue that we wanted to advocate. First, although this debate is usually posed between secularism and religion generally speaking, the real debate often focuses specifically on tensions between secularism and Christianity. There has not been much work done at all on either side to acknowledge or explore how the increasing religious diversity in American life impacts the debate, which is the focus of the work that Annie and I have been doing. Second, the discussion of the role of religion in public life often concentrates on the legitimacy of using religious reasons in an attempt to garner support for one's position. It is often assumed that the political agent has her mind made up at this point and must choose how to articulate her view publicly. But it's essential to realize that in doing that, neither side in the debate actively encourages citizens to dialogue with, understand, and learn from those who think differently. And that's where our interest is, on this dialogue where citizens are openly exploring different positions in an attempt to make up one's mind about a given issue. So before you've got your conclusion made, how could inclusive discourse be constructive to that process? In this setting, a person could be open to hearing from a variety of sources. Engaging in critical reflection of these sources could help solidify her original thinking as opposed to the other views, or could move her thinking in a new direction. And Annie and I are going to move forward to talk a little bit more about what this type of dialogue that we're thinking about looks like. So let me just say a little bit more, and then Annie will come back up here. But we're going to leave some time for question and answers as well. Cornel West, going back to his book Democracy Matters, recognizes this need for healthy, inclusive dialogue to address the problems facing America in the 21st century. According to West, a thriving democracy needs prophetic voices to implore us to justice. Although he identifies personally with the Christian tradition, West includes a role for prophetic voices from the rich traditions of Judaism and Islam as well, citing several examples of how these religions support and encourage democracy. For West, public debate amidst prophetic voices from these traditions should be neither a crude clash of civilizations nor an imposition of one upon the other. Rather, it should be a Socratic process of examining a rich past of cultural cross-fertilization. These energies provide a hope for new democratic possibilities. Arguably, voices beyond the three major Western religions can also provide rich resources for political discourse. We've heard about Patel and Obama talking about these possibilities as well. But what Annie and I found, and Annie will say more about this, in talking with people is, on the face value, this sounds like a great idea. Sure, why not? But in reality, why are none of us actively promoting these sorts of conversations? How often are we really engaging with people of different views, whether that's religious views or other views, to try to help us inform our thinking about political issues? It's easy for many Americans to read the remarks of West or Patel or Obama and casually affirm their claims. Our nation prides itself on a rich heritage of protecting religious freedom and tolerating religious difference, but allowing different religious groups to exist is not the same as engaging different traditions in order to understand them better and identify what they could actually contribute to political life. Abstractly acknowledging the important place of blues in American musical history, as West does, is not the same as engaging the blues and allowing that blues sensibility to broaden one's social and political imagination. Eboo Patel argues that engagement between the religiously diverse is a key component of strengthening our democracy. By building bridges between different faith communities, we affirm the identity of the constituent communities while emphasizing that the well-being of each and all depends on the health of the whole. It is the belief that the common good is best served when each community has a chance to make its unique contribution. The model of pluralism he envisions is neither mere coexistence nor forced consensus. Rather, it actively encourages an ongoing dialogue between citizens from various religious and secular perspectives that enables shared understanding and opens the potential for social and political partnerships. It's important to notice that as we're talking about this idea of political pluralism, and we said this at the beginning, that pluralistic dialogue in the public sphere does not have to entail taking a position of theological pluralism. And so as we're thinking about applying a blue sensibility to religious difference, we want to make this important distinction. And Diana Eck puts it nicely in thinking about distinguishing between the rhetorical and social context of our theological and civic language, between the spheres in which we engage questions of concern, either as citizens or as people of faith, is essential. It's not that religious discourse is private, whereas civic discourse is public. Rather, both religious and civic speech can be very public, but they're different. They're directed to different audiences, they employ a different rhetoric of persuasion, they are substantiated with different footnotes and appeals to authority. So for example, right, when we're engaged in theological discourse and questioning from the perspective of theological pluralism, you're thinking about, is there only one God? Are all religions true? Can there be more than one right path? But in the category of civic pluralism, what you're thinking of is this issue of what sorts of reasons should be allowed within the public sphere. Should the state be neutral with regards to religion? Is secularism really a neutral position? How do we best navigate peace locally, nationally, and internationally in the midst of religious difference? And so in this issue, one of the things that Annie and I have worked through is making an argument that theological pluralism and civic pluralism don't have to be linked. That one can advocate civic pluralism without advocating theological pluralism, and by seeking and attaining understanding of another religious tradition, we're not necessarily requiring agreement with that tradition. Wolf has some helpful things to say on that idea, that love does not mean agreement and approval, it means benevolence and beneficence, possible disagreement and disapproval notwithstanding. And Annie's going to come and share more of her writing and reflections on that topic.
Our civic positions may be informed by theological views, and understanding the civic positions of someone from a different tradition may likely require an attempt to understand their theology. However, this does not entail that one's civic conclusions must be the same as one's theological conclusions. While engaging with the other may change one's thoughts, success is measured by the sincere pursuit to understand, not the manner of the conclusions drawn. Engaging with the religious other lends itself to a variety of interactions. While theological discourse can arise from such interactions, dialogue need not manifest itself in this way, being that the basis for engagement centers on the political issue at hand, not on truth claims. As a result, participants can learn from a plethora of political views from religious backgrounds without being barraged by pure theology. Not only does this create an atmosphere that is much more conducive to social progress, it also provides a new platform for political discourse, one that gives a seat at the table to the religious other. When we engage in meaningful political action, including dialogue about public matters with a diverse group of citizens, we open the possibility for achieving something greater. In light of this, citizens should consider it their responsibility to actively pursue diverse perspectives so our liberal democracy may function at the highest level possible. This includes an active engagement with diverse religious traditions in order to learn what each specifically contributes to our democracy. It is our position that these traditions are essential to understanding the American story in a manner that renders the whole greater than its parts. If we are to sustain a thriving democracy in the 21st century, we must progress beyond toleration towards efforts to learn and understand. Our nation prides itself on a rich heritage of protecting religious freedom and tolerating religious difference. But allowing different religious groups to exist is not the same as engaging different traditions in order to understand them better and identify what they can contribute to political life. In the words of Glenn Tinder, author of The Political Meaning of Christianity, "Of all injustices the oppressed suffer, the most degrading and destructive is that they are not seriously listened to. There is no more radical denial of the humanity of any group than the refusal of attention. Nor is there a more effective way of rendering social wrongs irremediable than by denying those subjected to them the opportunity and ability to speak." The fact that we are different, society to society or individual to individual, is not the direct source of conflict. Rather, conflict stems from those that assign a hierarchy to these differences. But reality is clear. Diversity is unavoidable. We cannot successfully or morally impose all our views on one another, and we cannot afford futile attempts at conformity. We are left with the need to communicate to find some tangible middle ground. The purpose of interfaith dialogue is to learn. More specifically, we learn in order to broaden our understanding of the religious other. Such learning personalizes the unfamiliar and humanizes our misconceptions. Dialogue can be pragmatic, but does not confuse efficiency as a moral good. We cannot solve social problems by sheer calculation. Instead, we must approach human problems with humility and humane solutions. It takes a dose of realism to understand that there are not formulaic answers to every problem. Dialogue may not be a mathematical proof, but it goes beyond speculating by initiating the process, opening the potential for social and political partnerships. If this is more widely practiced, not just recognized, the quality of our public discourse will improve as the standards for our starting points contain greater self-awareness, a larger capacity for empathy, and a humility which acknowledges historical injustices and current wrongs. And taking away from the Edgren Scholarship program that we, a project that we worked on a more personal note, I kind of came to the conclusion that what I took, like the most significant thing that impacted me from this experience is that I think it's incredibly important as religious individuals, we take a critical and analytical look at our beliefs. Which beliefs stem out of genuine religious convictions, and which of our beliefs do we use religion to justify? For example, the prosperity gospel takes our innate human propensity towards greed and justifies this with a doctrine of materialism supported by a contrived rendition of the gospel. In the words of Fyodor Dostoevsky, man has such a predilection for systems and abstract deductions that he is ready to distort the truth intentionally. He is ready to deny the evidence of his senses only to justify his logic. An important distinction to make is this. In terms of successful dialogue, what one believes is just as important as the manner in which one holds these beliefs. Listening, truly listening, to the religious other can be practiced regardless of conservative or liberal leanings.
Thanks, and I just want to give credit to Annie. One of the beautiful things about the Edgren program is the collaborative nature of the projects. Everything that she read are things that she wrote. It was fantastic to be able to work mutually on a project together, and I've learned so much from Annie as well. So the presentation that you heard today, we did write a paper this summer as we were working through our research and finding we couldn't advocate for constructive models because there aren't really those out there. So we wrote a paper in which we tried to make a strong argument for why citizens need to take this responsibility seriously and make that case as a first step to thinking more about what those constructive models might look like. We're happy to take questions and answers. We also had a question for you, if any, feel free to comment on this. But we're curious to know if any of you have had experiences dialoguing with people of other faith traditions and had those conversations informed your political views, not just your theological views. So perhaps some of you have feedback or input for this as well. But so feel free to jump in on that question or ask questions of Annie and I.
First, I just want to say, Annie must have incredible
I did ask her if it was nature or nurture, her writing ability.
Probably.
And I think it's both.
I'm interested in, you talking about the lack of and the need for these structures, and I'm sitting here trying to envision them. So we call together a meeting, and we have a specific issue, say hunger, or immigration policy, or whatever that we want to bring all these traditions to. How do you balance even their kind of theoretical discussions about what my tradition has to say with with practical discussions of, all right, where are we going to get this food, how are we going to distribute it, what are the times? It seems like if you start with that, maybe theoretical isn't the right word, but the sort of philosophical / theological, you could easily never get to the practical. And there will be a lot of people who want to say, yeah, but what are we really going to do about this? And so I'm thinking maybe one of the reasons that these things don't exist is that it's very hard to wed those two things in actual meetings of people. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that a lot of the difficulty with the structures that we currently have is that they are theoretical, and a lot of them are designed to be theological in nature, interfaith dialogues, and that's okay. I mean, that can serve a constructive purpose as well. But I think you're exactly right. And when I do see examples that I think are starting to point in the right direction, there's limitations of them, it is giving something a practical focus. So the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is based out of Chicago, and they take students from junior high age up through college and engage them in service projects together, and then afterwards talk about their faith traditions. So let's get a bunch of junior high kids together to go work on a habitat house, and then afterwards get some pizza and talk about, oh, how does Islam encourage you to want to build a habitat house? How does Christianity encourage you to do that? So do the practical part first. Figure out what the need is. Because the beauty of it is we find that there's so many moral issues where even if our motivations for them are different, because one is coming out of Islam, one is coming out of Christianity, one is coming out of Judaism, one is coming out of Hinduism, it might, in a lot of cases, still lead to a very similar conclusion, and there's a lot of strength in that politically, as well as a lot of civic good in that relationally. One example that we have in Minnesota is the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition, and it's a group of Christians, Jews, and Muslims that every year have a Day on the Hill event, where in the morning they meet to talk about a topic like fair housing or hunger or poverty issues, and then they develop concrete lobbying strategies to go to the State House with later that day. So that's another example of trying to blend the theoretical with the practical. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that's the balance that has to be forged, and we would do more good to start with the practical, because I mean, I'm a philosopher, right? I could sit in the ivory tower all day. So, you know, what if I forced myself out and started with what I think the conclusion is supposed to be?
I think there's a lot of conservative Christians who really feel like the public sphere is being de-Christianized. You know, I mean, there's this. We're so concerned about "in God we trust" being taken off our coins, and so we want to hold on to this civic religion and so forth. But you know, if you look at, for instance, Islam, we're not going to kill all Muslims, and we're not going to convert them all. And so, how do we find ways to work together? And should we, as conservative Christians, welcome or support or tolerate the disappearance or the reduction in the public sphere of sort of Christian symbols, civic religious symbols? Say nothing about the introduction of other religious symbols in the public sphere. Yeah.
You probably have more to say in this than I will. I think it's important. Part of advocating for this dialogue is shifting the focus away from. I don't want to say that that's less important, but you take an issue like "in God we trust" on our currency, and then you take something like hunger or poverty or different issues to work towards. I think the dialogue is more concerned with sort of these social injustices that are really hurting people and affecting people, and less concerned about public symbols, I guess I'd say. You probably have more to add to that.
Yeah, a couple of things, and I think that this is a good conversation for people within evangelical and or conservative circles to be having, because I think, you know, as Annie's saying, it forces the question of what are the action issues going to be, and I think also I just had two trains of thought at the same time, so let me try to sort them out. I think on the one hand, as Christians feel like the role of religion in the civic sphere is being eroded, there's some powerful allegiances that can be forged with other religions in that fighting back. I mean, part of the problem with the political debate in political philosophy is that it's secularism versus Christianity. It should be secularism versus all religions present in the United States, and then you find secularism is a very small minority, and secularism is trying to sell itself as the neutral way to go. Well, it's not neutral at all. It's just one of all of the other competing voices in the discourse. And I think Christians, instead of focusing so much energy on fighting the secular forces, why not look at trying to build stronger alliances with other religious partnerships and groups? But I think it does ask Christians to take seriously the notion of the changing demographics of the United States, particularly since 1960 moving forward as immigration laws have changed, and the degree to which Christians have experienced Christian privilege. And to be a healthy democracy, do we need to be a Christian democracy, or can we have more space? I mean, a really pluralist democracy is going to have trouble with only one type of symbolism being used in the public sphere.
As far as like looking towards solutions, could you pick one area that you think would be the easiest to start the transition in? I mean, would it be poverty? Would it be hunger? Would it be, you know, I mean, what would be, do you think, the easiest one to develop success in the end that we could work toward first?
I don't know that it's picking a certain issue to tackle first, as much as it's doing it on an individual kind of grassroots level of practicing it personally in your own life and having dialogue with the religious other and having that inform your political views. And then I think that the big issues will follow.
Yeah, both Annie and my Edgren project, and then Marian Larson and Anna Wilson, and this is the presentation that we gave in Atlanta at the CCCU conference, was about how to build this into curriculum, how to get college students involved in interfaith dialogue such that you start to learn how to have these conversations, you start to learn how to become friends or build relationships with people who think very differently from you, and then thinking about ways to get the civic issues to play a part in the development of those relationships, as well as movement towards civic goals. I think there's a lot of issues you could pick from: environmental, poverty, AIDS, housing, healthcare. You know, there's so many that we share, but it's but often, yeah, that conversation isn't happening.
How do you deal with the challenge of pluralism within religious communities? And we talk about, you know, Christian, Muslim, Jew. Well, there's a lot of different views within each of those communities. We have the polarization of fundamentalisms within each of those groups. It seems to me one of the difficulties in having that dialogue is who's speaking for any given religious group. So how do you negotiate that?
Yeah, these are all very good questions, and I appreciate them. I think, you know, intra-religious dialogue is often as important as inter-religious dialogue about these issues. One of the most common themes that Marian and I have heard back from students when we've taken them to interfaith dialogues, and these would be primarily the first-year students, not as much the junior and senior level students that have gone. But so first-year students, the things that they come back with most are, wow, on the one hand, I never even knew Baha'i existed as a faith tradition, but also, wow, I had no idea that there were so many Christians who thought differently about me than this. And they actually often come away feeling like they're a minority within Christianity, and part of that is the theological, dimensions of who participates in interfaith dialogue. But I think that's really important, and I think that, again, avoiding theological statements about pluralism. Ibu Patel talks about it in terms of we need to find the stories in our tradition that support movement in this way. So even if it doesn't reflect the views of all Christians, what are the stories that we tell? Who are we giving the voice to? West, going back to the civil rights movement and the role of religion playing in that, I think provides some examples. But that conversation has to be happening internally as well. And that's part of the issue of Annie and I went back and forth on the paper in terms of who was our audience, because we felt like there was so much just to say to Christians about this issue, and why are we, and motivating Christians as well as to a broader audience beyond Christianity.
think we're going to need to be extensively trained to do this. I mean, I think especially as Christians, we are trained to convert, not collaborate. So what is the goal underlying some of this for us? How do we know how to do that?
I don't think it's a matter of just being really good at dialogue. I think it has a lot to do with having humility and just being able to listen. Like, it's not necessarily that you can kind of show off all these skills of being able to relate to all these different people. It's really just listening and taking away what you can, and, you know, answering questions that they have for you. And I think anyone is capable of it.
I think in the projects that we've been doing in the classroom, we frame them as learning to listen projects, that there is a time to speak, but there is a goal to be learned of listening. But I also think sometimes we make it harder than we have to. My parents, you know, as they're learning about the research I've been doing recently and those sorts of things, they've had Muslim neighbors who have lived next door to them for 20 years. They've had every other family on the block to their home for dinner, but not the Muslim family that we'll talk to if we're all outside at the same time, you know. And my dad asked the question, you know, what would it look like for me to start thinking about this? And I said, invite the neighbors over for dinner. Well, what would I say? You know, I think a lot of times we have in our mind that the differences are greater than they are, and that, you know, that maybe working on a habitat house together with people from different faith traditions isn't as hard as it might look, and those are the ways that you start.
Just reflect a little bit of history from here, and Dan, you might remember this, but way back in the day, you know, 28, 30 years ago, the course that's like college writing, we had students read Time Potok's The Chosen. And then we invited a Hasidic rabbi to come and speak, and we learned very quickly that we needed to do what you are suggesting, to say that this is a listening time, not a proselytizing time. You know, well, don't you see Jesus in the Psalms? And, you know, they would come. So we learned that we needed to just prepare them to learn and listen, be quiet and listen, and that preparation is important. Yeah.
Right, and it's also not to marginalize the importance of also believing in the truth of our religious convictions. Eboo Patel, who you've heard us quote a few times, is a devout Muslim, and I heard him give a speech in Minneapolis about a year ago, and somebody asked him a question and answer time. Well, what do we do? The evangelicals aren't going to want to buy into this. They don't play nice at the playground. What do you do with the evangelicals? And Eboo Patel, a devout Muslim, gave the best answer to this question that I've ever heard. And he said that he respects people more the more sincere and, you know, they are about their faith, that they actually believe what they believe is true. And he expects that of the other people that he's interacting with. He said in the speech, in the question and answer time, that Bill Hybels and Rick Warren are actually two personal friends of his. And they have the theological conversations. All three of them know exactly where the cards are on the table. But that knowing where the cards are on the table doesn't prevent the friendship from collaborating on social and political and civic matters as well. And I think it's important that we continue to figure out how we hold these things in tension.
Yes.
I'll just build on what she says, Cindy said about the rabbi who came. He unpacked some things about the law and attitudes toward the law that I still repeat, and this is 30 years, that just kind of, wow, I never thought about it that way. I mean, that was a theological issue, but you know, it was very illuminating to me how just a short time with this guy, I learned a lot about my own understanding of my faith tradition.
That reminds me of when I was in college, attending a synagogue for part of a class project and meeting with the rabbi afterwards, and the rabbi was talking about how they never spend any money on the church building itself so long as there's a physical need of someone in the congregation. And I have always taken that with me as the, you know, what are the priorities? What is the, you know, the highest good that we should be looking after and motivated for?
I had a brief, I noticed, so finding the political sphere, you had a hard time finding these frameworks. Are you aware of any other sort of communities of practice that have some other ideas? Or so, for instance, my brother's a chaplain, and he does a lot of work, sort of this interfaith dialogue, or even dealing with people in crisis who are not even in his own Christian faith, but he still, or he gives sermons to, you know, considering all these different faiths. So I just wonder if there are other communities that you think that would be even good models to bring into sort of the political sphere, or ideas that, things that you experienced, or ideas you have. Or...
And I don't know how relevant this is as a response, but I know that, and I think it was reflected in the Diana Eck quote, but there's other communities around the world, globally, that the dialogue is absolutely essential because they live in religious conflict and they can't find a common ground. So I think for us, we kind of get in this false sense of like, well, you don't really have to deal with that because we can essentially isolate ourselves. But I mean, religious diversity is growing in America. It's really just a matter of time before it becomes more of a pressing issue, and why not like prepare ourselves to participate in that dialogue and kind of avoid the repercussions that could come if we're not prepared.
I send my adult students to different cultural experiences, some of which are faith-based, and a few months ago, some of them went to Ridley, to a mosque, and one of them, who's a very open-minded person, she went there and she got there ahead of the others, and so she was sitting in her car waiting for the others and looking around, and I think that's a terrorist, I think that's a terrorist, you know. And I mean, this is just how a lot of people think, you know. And then they went inside. This is common, I'm telling you, this is common. And they went inside and they were so warmly welcomed. And this is a group that they claim to have the oldest interfaith dialogue in the state of Minnesota. 18 or 30 years, I can't remember which, but a long time, at least 18 years. And they were so warmly welcomed that then those feelings went away. They realized how silly they were and how common their humanity was with one another. And just even one exposure can, you know, start this going. Yeah, so I'm glad you're doing this.
Right, I think fear is really one of the biggest obstacles we have of this. Fear of what we don't know, fear of our misperceptions of the other, fear of doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing, you know. But yes, and I think those a starting place that Annie and I see is, you know, those experiences that bring us together on civic matters and give us a chance to build those relationships can be really constructive.
And I think on the flip side of this dialogue, not only is it a chance to listen and gain knowledge from other perspectives, but it gives you a chance to show Christians aren't all abortion doctor killers, you know? It's not always manifested in these really extreme ways, like there are other types of Christians, and it kind of clears up misconceptions for the religious other that you're talking to.
Well, thank you all for these questions. It helps